Mr Owen.
Thank you, my lady. Mr Swan, before the adjournment, we had just looked at what you said to the Northern Ireland Assembly on the 1st of March, and that you'd conveyed that it was far from certain that Covid-19 would develop into a pandemic. And I think where we had gotten to then was what you conveyed on the 2nd of March to the Executive Committee meeting. And if we could perhaps please bring that up at INQ 000 065 694, please. And again, just to see the date of that, it's the 2nd of March. And we can see that you provided an initial update confirming that the first positive case had been recorded in Northern Ireland. Let's see reference to the legislation. And if we go over the page, please. I think we can see that the CMO attended this meeting. And that if we go over the page, please, to page 3. I think that we can see then some of the information that was being provided at the top. Most people, minor illness, like a cold. 98% will get better. And I think we also see at the bottom, the Chief Medical Officer continued tough decisions. And I think if we just go over the page, please, I think we see reference to not being inevitable either. Sorry, I think it's at the bottom of that page. Yes, modelling, contain. So that's a reference to Northern Ireland being in the contain phase, isn't it?
Yes.
And not inevitable. Again, was that part of the same message that was being conveyed, that Northern Ireland was in the contain phase and that it wasn't inevitable that this would become a pandemic?
Yep.
So even at the 2nd of March, that was still the message being conveyed to your ministerial colleagues?
From the CMO at that point, yes.
Okay.
But again, because need to prepare for weeks. This will be for weeks and months. Very transmissible virus.
Yes. I think again, it's just understanding what the understanding of your colleagues would have been at this stage, based on the advice that was being given to them by the CMO. I think that can come down, please. And I think just in terms of, again, what was being advised or what you were being briefed about in and around this time, I think if we could go, please, to INQ 000 425611, please. So again, this was a briefing for the executive. I think if we go over the page, please, to page 2. And if we look at paragraph 2. Who have announced that the outbreak has reached a stage where it can be described as a pandemic. This does not have any material implications for how we respond to the outbreak in Northern Ireland. Can you explain that? Because that might seem like an extraordinary thing to have been said in a briefing.
I think what that is attempting to describe in regards to that document is that although we have now announced that the stage can be described as a pandemic, it hasn't made any changes as to how Northern Ireland is currently responding or the preparation work that is being done.
And just again, help us with what that work was in actual fact and what was being done on any sort of cross-departmental basis.
Well, again, that's
to prepare for the pandemic.
Sorry, that's the point of the 16th of March, where those MPIs were starting to be talked about across COBRA as well in regards to actually that preparation for what was going to become the national lockdown in regards to that in the week later, on the 23rd of March. So I think taking that one paragraph in context and the rest of the document, the lady is actually saying that although it has been now announced that the World Health Organization is describing as a pandemic, is not having any material impact on the other actions that are actually happening. And if you look down through the rest of the paper there, paragraph 4 expands as to what has actually been talked about there in regards to what had been talked about at the ministerial meeting on the 20th of March in regards to no school closures as of yet. FCO and DHSC will change travel advice for those over 70 or underlying health conditions. So it's really about getting ready for that. And that announcement from the World Health Organization hasn't changed that direction of travel.
Again, I'm just going to focus on I suppose, what alarm bells were, as it were, being rung in Northern Ireland in and around this stage. And you had previously said in the course of your evidence about the Gold Group being convened. And are we to understand that that was a significant step as well within the Department of Health?
It is a significant step, yeah, after reaction.
I think what you say in your witness statement, though, and I just want to check that this is correct, and I'm looking, if we need to go to it, I will, and this is your, I think it's your January, yes, it's your statement of the 15th of January. You say at paragraph 27, an extraordinary meeting of the top management group was held on the 4th of March 2020, and you refer to a note that confirmed that the top management group's agreement to the full activation of the Health Gold Command was circulated the following day, advising that the strategic cell had been convened and would have its first meeting on the 9th of March 2020. So can you just help then? Was that the strategic group being convened on that date?
So in regards to, I think, paragraph 27, in regards to that, the strategic cell had been convened.
So it seems to suggest that the top management group's agreement to the full activation of the Health Gold Command in fact took place on the 5th of March 2020, is that correct?
And again, that's the full activation. There's a number of steps that had been taken in regards to building that up, in regards to the correspondence that had already been evidenced earlier on in regards to coming from the Chief Medical Officer to Valerie Watt, to the Health and Social Care Board, as to the gradual increase as to the full activation of gold.
Right, and having looked at this strategic cell that had been set up, that is in fact, isn't it, or part of its role was to provide strategic direction and advice to HSC organisations and to you, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So why was that cell providing strategic advice to you not set up until this point in time in March? Again, that might be thought to be very late in the day indeed.
Again, I suppose in retrospect, my lady, I was receiving that strategic advice from my permanent secretary and the Chief Medical Officer and his team, the Chief Social Worker and the Chief Nurse, in regards to what needed to be done. But it was the formalisation and the step up of that cell at that point in time, whereas it's a formalised structure rather than the more one-to-one briefings that I had been receiving.
So are you suggesting that the activation of the cell in fact made no difference to the advice that you were receiving at that point in time in any event?
It was the more formalised structure in regards to that advice coming through. So it gave it a structure to be delivered to me as Gold Strategic Cell rather than coming from those individual chief officers and policy leads.
What does that add that wasn't there previously?
I think it's the formal structure. The actions has actually been taken at a Gold level rather than coming from the individual cells that have been previously activated.
But in substance, what difference does it make?
In substance, the briefing papers still come. I suppose it's the culmination of where they come from, whether it's an overarching body or from a single cell or policy lead as an individual.
Can we look at the note, I think, that was generated by the first meeting of that group on the 9th of March? It's at INQ 000 433 481, and look at the actions. And we see there, first action, possibility of invoking NICMA to involve TEO further, to be discussed further with CMO. This is the 9th of March. Mr. Swan, why was the possibility of invoking NICMA still being discussed only as a possibility within your department at this time?
I wasn't part of that meeting, and as I've said earlier on, and in my statement, I agree with David Sterling's, where I could have seen a possibility of a benefit of standing NICMA up earlier than it was actually did to actually raise alarm bells or raise issues across the rest of the other departments. So again, it goes back to the position at that point being taken by the Permanent Secretary and the Chief Medical Officer, as that wasn't the right point in actually activating NICMA. As I said, in previous engagements this morning, that there was other options, other bodies who could activate NICMA and Milady in regards, but not being part of that meeting or that context as to why it was still being considered only a possibility at that stage. I can't comment further, because it moves on to say that issue should be discussed further with the CMO.
Yes, well, I think maybe that's the point, that whether or not Northern Ireland's civil contingency arrangements in the TEO ought to be set up is a matter of discussion with the CMO. Again, that might be thought quite surprising that the Chief Medical Officer would have a role in potentially deciding whether or not the arrangement should be stood up, or whether or not even TEO ought to be involved further at this point in time.
Well, I think, as has been discussed in our earlier evidence sessions, that TEO has the ability to initiate NICMA on its own. I think there is commentary around from the head of civil service at that time and officers within CCPB, NI, in regards to actually they would wait on the Chief Medical Officer's request, which I think is incorrect in my understanding, that they could have actually invoked NICMA on their own at that point.
But do you agree what this reflects is that your department thought, and that it was its role to decide whether or not, or that it was in the driving seat as to whether or not Northern Ireland's civil contingency arrangements should be stood up?
No, sorry, and again, it's difficult, my lady, because I wasn't at the meeting, and it's not even two full lines of what was there. So from an action point, I still think it indicates that there's a possibility of invoking NICMA by the Department of Health and to involve TEO further, and that was to a point that was actually to be discussed further with the CMO.
Well, if we go on, please, to the meeting that took place the next day at the Executive Committee, INQ 000065695, and this is now on the 10th of March. And I think we can see that, again, you're updating the Executive Committee as to what was going on. And I think you do say there, a couple of points up from the bottom, looking to other departments for coordination. And then if we go over the page, I think we see reference to organisations taking their own advice and reference to St. Patrick's Day. I think to the Deputy First Minister saying executive approach needs to kick in, all need to contribute. That's just a few lines up from the bottom of the page. And then if we go over the page to page 3, the First Minister asking civil contingencies, have we got plans to handle? And references to departments needing advice. It does appear that even by the 10th of March 2020, that there was no sense of any sort of cross-departmental response to COVID-19 in Northern Ireland. Do you agree?
I would agree that is what is clearly demonstrated here, and I think it comes on actually later on, Milady, and I apologise for jumping forward, but I think there's a letter I sent to FMDFM, I think it's about the 29th of March,
yes,
where I actually highlight that thing. So I think the note, and again, I stress the handwritten notes from this minute aren't verbatim, but I think it shows the Deputy First Minister and First Minister actually looking to their officials, looking to Hawks, and saying, where is our coordinated response? Have we got plans to handle this? Where's the advice to the organisations? So it's the First Minister and Deputy First Minister asking out loud in an executive meeting to officials who are there, what are we doing in regards to this?
But Mr. Swan, that might be thought again, I don't want to overstate this, but utterly extraordinary that by the 10th of March, questions were being asked about, do we have plans for civil contingencies? A cross-departmental approach needs to kick in. I mean, what was actually being done across Northern Ireland at this point by the government?
Well, my lady, I can speak on behalf of the Department of Health in regards to what was being done. We were undertaking, we'd raised our surge plans, we'd moved from silver, we'd moved to gold. We were issuing advice and guidance to our arm's length bodies and to those organisations that they relied on us to do that. We were providing briefings to Northern Ireland Civil Contingency, CCGNI. My Permanent Secretary was engaging with his...
Please.
Oh, sorry, apologies.
Apologies. I appreciate you trying to save time. But...
Yeah, no.
So I got to briefings to civil contingencies. You then said your Permanent Secretary.
Right. Permanent Secretary was engaging with his counterparts as well as regards to that. So I think from a cross-government response, I honestly cannot answer to that, but I know what we were doing within the Department of Health, and I referred earlier on, my lady, to that point, that minute that it gets exchanged between TEO officials in regards to the 4th of March, in regards when the Chief Medical Officer and myself visited the Northern Ireland hub, asked to see what was there, and it's obvious now from what I've seen, from what I know from this briefing, that central organisation was understaffed, it was struggling, that would have been highlighted continually, I think, at that TEO level. But it wasn't until the First and Deputy First Minister actually raised these issues, I think quite rightly, at that point, that the rest of government, the rest of that civil contingencies approach actually kicks in.
Well, first of all, going to the hub, there wasn't a hub until much later in March. So, I mean, there isn't even a question of there being a hub in existence.
No, well, sorry, there's a physical, there's a space. There's a physical hub that has computers and all the rest of it in different stalls and sets. So that's where we'd actually went at that point in time. So there is a physical entity.
Yes, but obviously having a room that's empty and that isn't playing any sort of part in coordinating departments across Northern Ireland isn't going to be much good to anyone.
No, and it wasn't. And I think that's the point. And I think knowing what I know now, I had expected that to be staffed up. I had expected it to be functional and ready to kick in as and when it was asked for. But in regards to evidence, I've received evidence this inquiry received, that wasn't the case. But
Mr. Swan, you've said on a number of occasions what I know now, but you knew at the time that those arrangements hadn't been called for or instituted, and also you knew that your department had advised that they didn't need to be set up as well.
But what I didn't know then was that there wasn't an ability, there wasn't a structure to stand up in regards to that. So it was always moving up to that point. If we had have asked for them, and again it goes back to that correspondence, if we'd asked for the hub to be activated, that there's a clear indication that the staff wasn't there to do that. That's the bit that I still find and do find concerning, that staff during that time, during February, end of January, February, even into the start of March, that there wasn't a central effort being made actually to put processes and people into place so that when it was called for, that it was actually being able to be activated.
So can we just be clear about this, and not as a matter of retrospect, but at the 10th of March, when ministers were starting to say an executive approach needs to kick in, do you agree that there had been no cross-departmental response to COVID-19?
There had been cross-departmental working. We were able to do that. And again, sorry to labour the point, but in regards to the Coronavirus Act, in regards to the interaction between departments as to what was actually being done at LAD level. So there was engagement across departments, but as to that central response, there wasn't the detailed work that I would have expected when we actually moved to calling for the activation of NICMA.
So forgive me, if the inquiry was seeking to identify the main thing that was done before this date to demonstrate a cross-departmental response, it would be the fact that some departments had commented on the draft legislation. Is that right?
It is more than simply a comment. When it comes to draft legislation in regards to what the Coronavirus Act, it was actually quite a significant piece of legislation. So it's not just the fact that they commented on it, it's the fact they would have been analysing their part to it, their response to it, and actually what it would have meant to them.
So we should focus on that. That should be what we look to in order to understand what the cross-departmental response was. Is that right? But
not only that, Milady, I think it's also the interactions that were being had by my permanent secretary, also by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer briefing civil contingency branches and well. So there's a range of engagements. But if you're talking about the physical, or I suppose that point where there's a point you can actually look at and say that's where Northern Ireland cross-government kicked in, here's the demonstration, here's the paper, here's the piece of evidence it is at that point, I would agree with you.
All right. So, and when you say that, are you referring to the 16th of March, whenever NPIs came in, or are you referring to the 10th of March?
I'm actually referring to the 10th of March, where the First and Deputy First Minister actually come forward and, I suppose, become engaged in that. It's also possibly at that point where the First and Deputy First Minister, prior to this meeting, actually started to attend COBRA as well.
That's right.
Because it was being led by the Prime Minister at that stage. So I think that indicates that that involvement of TEO structures as well as an overarching body, as actually the Executive Office, as an approach to a coordinated response.
I just want to pause before we go further and just to ask you about, again, your statement, and please, if we could have this up, it's your 24th of January statement at paragraph 66. It's on page 26, and that's INQ 000412903. 903. So again, does that capture your evidence that it was the 10th of March, whenever
Yes.
there was an understanding in Northern Ireland? And do you accept responsibility, Mr. Swan, for the fact that it was only at the 10th of March that there was that understanding on the part of your ministerial colleagues that this is what was required?
I have said, and I think, my lady, at the beginning of this, if I hadn't been sounding the alarm bells early enough with that level of seriousness, alarm, as has been, I suppose, perceived here, that my other colleagues weren't picking up on, other executive colleagues that weren't picking up on the briefings that were being given to their permanent secretaries that weren't being fed through. If that was a failing on my behalf at that time, I'm perfectly willing to accept that responsibility as a failure on my behalf.
You said if.
Oh, sorry, I'll remove the F. Sorry.
I'm asking you rather more than that, whether or not you accept that you do have responsibility for colleagues not understanding until this very late stage.
I don't think I'm responsible for colleagues not understanding the seriousness of COVID in regards to the outworkings of what actually happened. What I'm saying, my lady, I think I've always accepted my responsibility and accountability for the office that I hold. It's something that I hold very serious. It's something that I've a great honour and privilege to actually hold. So if there's a failure on my part, my behalf, to alert other ministers as to what was coming down the line, I'll accept that.
If we please go forward in time to the 16th of March, to INQ 000065689. This is the meeting of the 16th of March, Mr. Swan. And obviously, we can see from the information that you're providing, I think that there was obviously, I think, a real escalation in concern by the point of this meeting about the situation. Do you agree?
Yes.
So, for example, the fact that there may not be enough ventilators, we can see that being referred to. And if we go over the page, please. I think we see as well reference to, yes, that's what you're saying, COVID, just looking at the midpoint in what you were conveying, COVID-19 is now with us. now real. And I think we can see at page 6, for example. Reference to it being a nightmare. I think page 7, there's reference to Northern Ireland having lost control. And page It may not be on that page, Mr. Swan, but I think we've got, it's just to help remind you of what the tenor of that meeting was like, that it was now real. It was a nightmare, that Northern Ireland had lost control, that people were terrified, and there was a need to show leadership. There's a reference to ministers not being shouted down, to the Minister for Justice, Miss Long, saying the executive always seems to be reacting, not leading. The Minister for Infrastructure having said we're mismanaging. And I think we see the reference in those notes to you having said we've been preparing for the past 7 weeks. That reference to we've been preparing for the past 7 weeks, presumably that was just a reference to the Department of Health.
Yes.
And again, so insofar as you could see from what had been done by your colleagues or their reaction, did you have any understanding or any insight into what was being done by other departments at this stage?
I hadn't, no.
And do you think that your ministerial colleagues had been planning in a robust way, as you might have expected by this stage?
By this stage, I think it becomes apparent that some of them hadn't been in regards to what had been expected, but it's also, the implication is that cross-departmental working as well, where everyone had a role to play.
All right. And if I'm not going to go through everything that happened in this meeting, because this is also the meeting at which consideration was given to whether or not to close schools. And is it right by the 16th of March that there weren't any plans in Northern Ireland that schools might close?
No, we were still following the sage advice at that point in time, which was to keep them open.
And that's why, for example, there's reference to the fact that if schools were to close, I think we've seen reference to this in another minute of the 12th of March, you're concerned that it might, for example, collapse the health system because there wasn't any contingency arrangements in place.
And I think it's not just in regards to the pressure it would have on the health system, but at that point I was also concerned of the implications of those children who had actually relied on school for free school meals, malaria and all the rest of it. So at that point it has become, I think, aware that we didn't have the preparations to be able to close schools in a managed and controlled sort of way. So there was no, as far as I was aware at that point, no mitigations or no opportunities where we could still see those essential workers, children being able to go, access to free school, those children who relied on free school meals. Those provisions actually haven't been made at that point. And that's why the executive, I think, rightly agreed that it would take a week actually to bring about school closure rather than closing them overnight.
Well, I think that the vote was, first of all, whether to close schools, that was voted against. And then the vote that won the day was to close schools when the CMO advised. It might be thought inappropriate that the decision whether to close schools would just be contingent upon what the CMO advised. Did you have any concern at that meeting that
I
decisions like that were being regarded as a matter essentially for him?
I did, and I don't think it's recorded in the minute, but it was one of those meetings where that vote was called, my lady, as a spur-of-the-moment vote that was called. I didn't think it was right that we did it. The counter that left it in the hands of the CMO I thought was better than moving immediately to closing schools, which I don't think we had, as a society, as Northern Ireland, had actually prepared for the consequences in doing that. It could have been, and I think if it had been portrayed or kept going along those lines, I think it was an unfair position to put the CMO in at that point in time.
All right, I'm going to come back to the CMO and his position in just a second. But when we get to the 19th of March, And again, I won't go to it, but you've set out in your statement of the 24th of January at paragraph 82 that it was only on the 19th of March that you realised the numbers of people that might potentially lose their lives in Northern Ireland on account of the virus and the numbers of people that might be affected. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that's come back to, I think it was the briefing at Cobra, where they set out, there was a very clear slide in regards to an 80% infection rate and a 1% mortality rate. And I've said this before, my lady, I did the calculation sitting on a piece of paper, and when I realised the number that we were talking about, so until then we've been talking about percentages, all the rest of it, but it wasn't until I saw that number and what potentially we could have been facing in regards to the number of deaths, the number of bereavements that we could have been facing in Northern Ireland alone, that really brought it to a level that, I think it's referred to, that just took it to another level.
But Mr. Swan, the percentages and the percentages of people who might get infected and the percentages of people who might die had been set out a considerable time before this. So why did it take until then, first of all, for the penny to drop with you and for you to convey that to your ministerial colleagues? Because those percentages, I think, changed from February through to the end of March, and at no time, and I've checked documentation, there's nowhere is that calculation actually done. So it is actually a calculation I sat and done. I'm not saying myself, but and that's, it was at that really, as I say, I can't explain why it wasn't in a previous briefing as to an exact number that was there. We worked out there was reasonable worst case scenarios, and other scenarios were put out and presented as well. But I think it was at that point that clarification of that black and white number that really brought things into a very sharp focus. So again, it might seem really stark, Mr. Swan, that on the 25th of January, Scotland was able to provide an overview, or advice was provided to Scotland about the potential ramifications on its health system based on WHO figures, that the Scottish Government should have that level of understanding at a very early stage. And that in Northern Ireland, we're talking about, first of all, it's the 19th of March, and it's you who's working out the figures rather than those who advise you. I mean, it might be thought, that might be thought really extraordinary now. Well, in hindsight, yes, but again, in regards to some of the preparation, I don't think it was solely reliant on that number in regards to what we were doing and what other departments were doing, and standing up their responses as well, from Department of Justice to the economy to ourselves. And again, I won't go back to the notes of the 19th of March, but I know you've said that you think the penny drops at around the 10th of March, but again, it is right that ministerial colleagues didn't have the sorts of numbers, the numbers of people who might or who were at risk of losing their life at this point. That was the first time that was spelt out to them, wasn't it? That's correct, yes. And I don't think, we'll hear from the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister when they give evidence, but it doesn't appear that they were in receipt of any sort of detailed medical or scientific advice before this point either. Do you agree? I'm not sure in regards to what advice you can speak to that. I won't press you on that. I want to go to a different point, though, that links to this. And if we could go, please, to INQ 000 308 444 and to page 3 of this, please. This is a message, I'm looking at the 24th of March. It's not a message that was sent to you, Mr. Swan. It's a message between Sir David Stirling and the Chief Medical Officer. And it relates to a meeting that took place on the 24th of March. And we can see that the CMO referred to the executive having lost the run of itself, that it turned into a cross-examination. But perhaps this is the most important point. They are now frankly getting in the way of a coordinated, effective response and making demands on my time and our team in health that we simply can't facilitate. That can come down, please. I'm sure that you accept, Mr. Swan, that no response to a pandemic can be driven entirely by officials.
Yes.
And that ultimately these matters couldn't be more grave, that they were a matter for the collective responsibility of the Executive Committee. Do you accept that?
I wouldn't. And as it started, my lady, that's when we were talking about the ministerial code, and I referred to paragraph 2.4 in regards to my responsibilities as to what I was actually bringing back to the Executive. And again, my lady, I'm not sure what the conversation was in regards to where that point or that exchange was during an Executive meeting, or what specifically it referred to, as I think as has been indicated. I wasn't part of that exchange.
But I think what might be thought of rather more concern was the idea that the Executive were getting in the way of a response, as opposed to being the people who were responsible and accountable for it, not the Chief Medical Officer.
But that's not my. It's not my position. It's not my comment. It's not my message. So
no,
you know,
quite so.
Yeah.
I think I'm asking really whether you agree, first of all, that that is right, that it was for them, and that they were both responsible and accountable to the people of Northern Ireland for the response.
Yeah.
And whether or not, I suppose, you have any concerns at the CMO seeing them as potentially getting in the way of the response.
And I say I'm not sure of the context or when that exchange was being made, if it was being made between officials, Chief Medical Officer, Permanent Secretary, so it'd be hard for me. It's hard for me to judge, but as far as being an elected representative, it was for the Executive to make those decisions.
Yeah. And in terms of the role of the Chief Medical Officer, we know that the Chief Scientific Advisor only came back into his post at around this time. Is it right to see the Chief Medical Officer as being the principal figure responsible for providing all of the advice up until this point to you and then to the Executive Committee?
And I think on Friday's presentation, when the Chief Medical Officer, he was supported by a strong team of Deputy Chief Medical Officers and the assistants and the senior medical officers in there as well, and that was synthesised. It was the direction of travel. It was the path of, I suppose, communication and engagement was through the Chief Medical Officer.
Yes, but from your perspective, I mean, obviously that then means that I think the Chief Medical Officer is the person who decides what advice and information goes into the briefings provided to you, correct?
I'm not sure if he was signing off on all the briefings, my lady, in regards to where they could have came from, the Chief Social Worker, Chief Nursing Officer, Chief Pharmaceutical Officer. You know, there are other avenues of getting advice and guidance to me. In regards to the specifics around the pandemic and at this point in time, I do believe the point of travel, or the point of engagement was through the Chief Medical Officer's office, yes.
Yes, so, and I am just focusing on the response to the pandemic as opposed to the other specific responsibilities that people like the Chief Social Worker might have had. But I just want to understand whether or not you regarded him as being the principal source of advice and information to you.
At that point in time, yes.
And that he controlled essentially what was provided to you. Or did you see underlying papers, what other people said?
Well, I suppose any submission that was coming to me, I'm not sure he had executive approval or authority to say yes or no. I would say that, my lady, my understanding would have been coming through my private or my permanent secretary in regards to those structures as well. So I'm not sure that cut-off point or ability to say yes or no rested solely with the Chief Medical Officer. I can't speak to that. But
even if you can't speak to that, it's a very straightforward question. Did you regard him as your principal advisor on the response to the pandemic?
Yes.
Can we move on, please, to the letter you've referred to, Mr. Swan, that you wrote on the 29th of March? It's INQ 000 023 229. and we can pick it up at paragraph 3. You said that we as a system have largely been in reactive mode, and that wasn't intended as a criticism. And I think if we just follow this on down, please. And at paragraph 3, that colleagues would recognise that whilst the Department of Health is at the forefront of many of the issues, this is an issue that impacts on all sectors. And if we could go over the page, please, and look at the final paragraph. And you set out in that context, I feel it would be useful if on Monday we could hear from colleagues in the Executive Office about their own strategic planning work and get a sense of that. Overarching regional strategy, I look forward to discussion. Yes?
Yes.
So, again, does this demonstrate that lack of responsiveness on the part of departments up and until this point in time?
I think it was a polite way of asking the First and Deputy First Minister to ask other departments, other ministers to take on some of the work that we were doing, rather than, and I still think around that time my frustration was that the pandemic, that COVID was still being seen solely through a health prism in regards to who had to react and where the reaction actually fell on, and it was asking for that, I suppose, openness about the strategic planning work that was being done elsewhere.
I think what we said, and we may have skipped over it on the first page, was that you said that you would be happy to explain where the department had reached. Yes, it's the penultimate paragraph. That you would be happy to share with colleagues where the Department of Health had reached.
Yeah.
So can we assume that up until that point in time, there hadn't been any sort of detailed briefing to ministerial colleagues about the planning, not just within the Department of Health, but across all of social care as well?
No, I think in regards to, there's actually a detailed paper and presentation that we made on the 29th of March to the Executive in regards to an update as to our COVID emergency response. I think, I can't remember the exact name of the paper, but we did present on the 29th of March of all the steps that we had taken across health and social care.
My question was a different one, Mr. Swan. It was whether or not before this point ministerial colleagues had been provided with that kind of detailed work to demonstrate what was being done in the Department of Health and in respect of all of social care in Northern Ireland as well.
I don't think they would have received a detailed briefing from me on the operational work of my department up until that point, no.
But again, Mr. Swan, in the context of a global pandemic that Northern Ireland was now feeling the full force of, and obviously at this stage there was also a lockdown, the idea that planning and that work just sat within your department without, for example, the Deputy First Minister or the First Minister understanding it, might be thought of as, again, I'm afraid I'm going to use the word extraordinary again. No. That should not be the subject of the most intense cross-government scrutiny and understanding.
And I don't think it was no intentional response from ours that it sat or was presented like that. I was always open to engagement, and and that's why I'm writing to the First and Deputy First Minister at that point. In regards to, here's what we've done to date, here's what we're doing. I'm happy to present it to the Executive for you actually to scrutinise, for you to ask what we've done, what we were doing in regards to that.
I think if we just, you've mentioned this presentation on the 29th of March, if we could just please go to INQ 000 065 748, please. So I think this is the meeting of the 30th of March. And I think if we could go, please, to, we can just see, sorry, forgive me, at the bottom of the page, we can see that it's a presentation, I think, by the head of the Civil Service. And if we just go on, please, to page 4. what I think we've seen is the presentation that was given by the head of civil service. And then we can just pick it up from the Deputy First Minister that it was useful, but there was a need to populate it with health information, that it was a collective executive responsibility, joined up working. Executive, it's not just health alone. Reference to, I think, working together, look forward to populating. And I think if we go on, please, to page 23. We see reference at the top to the department, and you can take it from me, this is, I think you already know this is the Deputy First Minister referring to the Department of Health as saying the executive is a thorn in its side. Yes?
Yes.
And isn't the reason for that, and what we've just picked up from those papers, that there was a departmental presentation and a cross-departmental presentation being given, but that there wasn't any health information, as it were, in it, that the Department of Health hadn't contributed to this cross-departmental briefing?
So I think, and again, I've said in my statement, I wasn't aware the Deputy First Minister had made that comment until I seen the hand-transcribed notes. But to get back to the substantive parts, there was two presentations, actually, to that executive meeting. There was the Department of Health's emergency response strategy, which was actually presented, and at the same time, the head of civil service presented a draft executive strategy and plan for future work. So there was actually two documents presented at that stage. The one coming from the executive office was in draft format. I didn't actually finalise presentation. I think the final presentation wasn't until the 28th of May, where that final paper came together. So with two different presentations with our Department of Health emergency response strategy and the executive's draft strategy and plan for future work. And I think what was requested there, that health should merge its way into the executive paper as well, because at that point we'd been asked to present where health was, and we'd done that.
If we just go to what you said in response or after that meeting, it's at INQ 000438904, and page 1, please. And we can see that we can see the time that you were emailing at, the early hours of the morning. And we can see that you were thanking those who had worked on a document over the weekend. You're referring to the CMO apologising for the time lost. Reference to there not being a view of the strategic direction, but rather ministers reverting to asking about testing and PPE. It was disappointing that the parting dig, so it would appear that
yes, I apologise, my lady. I did not mean to mislead the inquiry in any shape or form.
Yes, and that you had a number of phone calls. But I think just focusing on the first paragraph, that the document had been produced largely to placate the demands from other executive colleagues. And again, was that how you saw the integration of the health response or the information to be provided to ministerial colleagues as something to placate them rather than something that was absolutely vital and necessary that they understood and integrated into
I think as regards to that specific document that we presented, there had been a lot of questions in regards to what we were doing, and it was always that focus on what's health doing. And again, I referred to it earlier on as, that section of each executive meeting where it was what's health, where is health, where's testing, where's PPE in regards, and that's what that document was actually to do, and it placate. Isn't meant in that stage, I don't think, as an insult as to the requests of executive colleagues, but it was to meet the requests in a single document, single format, where we could actually demonstrate to other ministerial colleagues as to what we were doing, what we had done. So it wasn't a part of, it wasn't about them and us. It was about here, as it was actually about a physical presentation demonstration as to all the steps that have been taken.
Because, Mr. Swan, this coincides with email correspondence that the inquiry has seen, albeit that the Deputy First Minister and First Minister haven't been asked to give evidence about it yet, whereby certainly the Deputy First Minister was setting out her concerns to Sir Richard Sterling about their sense of lack of control over the response to the pandemic, and specifically the concern about your department. And I think I'm going to summarise it if I may, but essentially acting in quite a unilateral way. And the First Minister, although not putting it in those terms, being concerned about the information that was coming from your department. And what I was going to ask you is whether or not in the course of your evidence today, you've in fact maybe demonstrated what the problem was, that you saw everything from a health perspective and from a Department of Health perspective without necessarily seeing any of the wider significance across Northern Ireland.
I wouldn't say I didn't appreciate or understand the wider significance, but in regards to, I think it was in your opening statement, the breadth of the portfolio, the response that we were having to take. As Health Minister, my focus in regards to presenting to the Executive was as Health Minister on health issues. The Economy Minister was responsible for economy, Education Minister responsible for education. And again, my lady, I am now aware of the frustrations of the First and Deputy First Minister through this inquiry. I only wish that expressed them at the time to myself in regards to how they were perceiving, how they thought I was perceiving them, because that was in no way intentional. And if you go back to that email of the 29th, I'm actually asking in regards to how we can engage and bring those two things together. So it wasn't about trying to set up those mechanisms. I am now through, I think, presentations and media reporting from last week in regards to how there was actually such a concern that senior civil servants were exploring ways of allowing TEO to step in and either replace me as Health Minister or take over the running of the department. My lady, I think by this stage I had an open and honest enough relationship with the First and Deputy First Minister. If they had these concerns, I only wished they'd have come to me and said, rather than have been populated through emails and within TEO.
Well, we can see that she described you as a thorn in the side of the executive, or sorry, that you saw the executive as a thorn in the side and that you knew that. So I think that would tend to suggest, Mr. Swan, that you did know that there were concerns about your department's unilateralism at that time.
I think you referred to it, and honestly, my lady, I didn't recall it through when it was presented to me or when I saw it in the handwritten notes, but obviously there it had irked me at that point in the 31st of March that I did refer to it. I think it was unfair reading the rest of it as to the work that we had. I actually questioned the fact that the Executive that has been rescheduled numerous times reverted, rather than looking to the strategic direction that was laid out, began questioning and reverting to questions on testing and PPE that we'd actually answered previously. So there's, I think, possibly a demonstration of frustration there where we'd come with a document, a proposal, or not a document, but setting out where we actually were in health, that was actually how it was received.
That, for example, the reference to PPE, we know from the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland that there were particular issues about the provision of PPE to Northern Ireland, that there were, I think it's right, particular shortages in Northern Ireland as regards to PPE. That's right, isn't it?
We had challenges, I think, as every other part of the United Kingdom had, Milady, and I know there is a specific work stream on PPE, but what we found when we went, I suppose as a department, as a nation, out onto the open market where we used to purchase our PPE, we were at the very end of a very long supply chain ordering what was comparatively small amounts. So that's why the ability to work at a UK level was important to us as well at that point, and around PPE, not meaning to get sidetracked.
Yeah, so again, it might be thought, well, it wouldn't be remotely surprising, would it, that your ministerial colleagues might be asking questions and pressing the point about PPE in the meetings.
No,
Indeed, they might regard that as their an essential part
I
of their
think they had been meetings prior to that that's actually covered in regards to where they had been asking questions about PPE. But I think if reading that email, it's that frustration in regards to rather looking at the document that we produced, that the questions reverted back to issues that I felt at that point we'd already answered or answered elsewhere. It wasn't that PPE wasn't an issue. Of course, it was an issue that exercised us day and daily in regards to making sure those supplies were there.
I just want at this stage to just go back over just very broadly what decisions, if any, had actually been made in Northern Ireland. I think, first of all, it's right, isn't it, that in terms of the decision to close schools on the 18th of March, that was effectively a decision taken by the UK government that effectively, as it were definitive of the position in Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So, in other words, ministers didn't have to make a decision about that. It was effectively made for them, wasn't it?
No. At that point, the executive could have still made a unilateral decision. I think my lady referred to the vote that was taken at that meeting. If that vote had went another way, we would have made a different decision in Northern Ireland.
That was the vote on the 16th of March, wasn't it?
Yes.
So, and the decision there, as we've already seen, was we'll move when the CMO advises us to. But that was taken over by events 2 days later, yes.
By SAGE, where the recommendation came from schools to close across the UK.
But there wasn't, or are you suggesting there was a sort of debate and discussion amongst the Executive Committee on the 18th of March whether to follow the UK lead? No,
but there was the opportunity, and there was a debate around whether to close schools on the 16th of March.
Yes.
Which, I thought maybe I'm picking you up wrong. I thought you were inferring that we were simply following the UK lead in closing schools and we hadn't made any other decisions or had any other debate around that. Whereas actually on the 16th we had, and it proved to be one that was actually quite controversial around that stage.
Yes, but you were obviously very clearly of the view, weren't you, on the 16th of March, that schools didn't need to close?
Yes.
That was
because
your position.
Yeah, that was my position.
And the advice
that was the position that we were coming through from SAGE, yes.
And that's what I'm going to ask you about. That position then changed on the 18th of March, didn't it?
Yes.
And that's really what I'm driving at. That change on the 18th of March and the closure of schools in Northern Ireland, that was because of the UK government's announcement, wasn't it, that schools would close?
Well, it was following SAGE advice, and the schools were closing across the UK. We took the decision at the executive level, to announce that we'd actually close schools on the 23rd.
Yes.
Not on the 18th, so it gave schools time to prepare for the concerns that they had.
But I don't think there had been any sort of proper considered discussion before then about what the ramifications of closing schools would be, above and beyond some consideration of the impact on the workforce.
But also in regards, I think the CMO had raised in regards to those schools or those children that needed access to free school meals and those other challenges as well. And that was the debate we actually had on the 16th in regards to.
That's a consideration about the impact of
closing schools.
Closing schools. But I mean, above and beyond what we see on the 16th of March, there wasn't any further or more deliberate or considered debate amongst you and your colleagues before the announcement on the 18th of March, was there?
Not at the executive level, no.
No. And in terms of the decision to lock down, what you've said in your witness statement was that you can't find, I think, any record of you having been advised between the 18th of March and the 23rd of March about whether or not a lockdown, for example, was required in Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
That's correct, because at that stage, the COBRA meeting, and I think it was the 16th, had discussed a series of MPIs, quite extensive MPIs, but when I was writing my statement, I wasn't able to find any detail where that decision point was actually reached.
So again, was that decision effectively one then? It was taken by the UK government without any consideration?
Well, it was a UK-wide lockdown, so yes.
But there had never been prior to that point any consideration or deliberation, had there, by the Executive Committee about whether a lockdown was needed in Northern Ireland and what the ramifications of it would be?
No, and I don't think looking at, again, in hindsight in regards to the NPI, those non-pharmaceutical interventions of closing down schools, the effect on, economy, shops and all the rest of it, I don't think that detailed conversation actually had been had at an executive level, because at that point I don't think anyone envisaged that we were going to the level of lockdown that we were actually going to see at the national level, or for the duration that it was going to be held for.
And I think it follows from all of that that there was none of the planning or infrastructure in place in Northern Ireland to deal with the lockdown when it came.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to, I know we didn't get back to it, was that interaction at the Executive Office level, which talked about Northern Ireland being 18 months behind from a non-health point of view.
So I'm going to come back, because I know you've said that on a number of occasions, Mr. Swan, and I think I need to give you the opportunity to explain that. But let me do it by way of questions. Do you consider that those deficiencies or that lack of capability in civil contingencies in Northern Ireland had a material impact on the response to the pandemic from January onwards?
Yes, I think that's the point. No, I don't think there's any challenge in regards to that, and in regards to that civil contingency preparedness on the non-health related contingency planning that could have been had, should have been done, even based on flu pandemic preparedness plans at that point as well.
And when did the penny drop amongst ministers in Northern Ireland that capability was quite as limited?
I think we've already touched. I think it was around that. I think it crystallised around that meeting on the 10th of March, and the reactions and the comments from the First and Deputy First Minister.
All right. So, is it your evidence that really, well, let me take this in stages. Looking back over all of this, is it your evidence that it really wasn't until the 10th of March that your ministerial colleagues actually understood just how grave a position Northern Ireland was in relation to the pandemic?
I can't speak on their behalf in regards to their personal understanding. What I am reflecting is as Health Minister, where I saw those departmental responses coming. So I am sure there were some ministers who were of a level of concern at that point, but what I'm looking at is the departmental response in regards to that, and I think it is really around that civil contingencies, that NIGMA approach around the 10th of March, where that collectively crystallises.
You say that you can't, that's a matter for them to account for, but as the minister who is leading the response, or whose department is the lead government response to the pandemic, it must surely be obvious to you, or you must be able to explain when you think, I'm going to use this phrase again, the penny dropped in Northern Ireland.
And as I say,
what was required to respond.
And I can't speak for each individual minister, because they did come with different perspectives as regards to the five-party coalition, from the parties they come from, the stances they come from as well. So I'm not sure whether they appreciated the seriousness of the whole way through, or the implications of the decisions that were going to have to be taken. So again, it is up to them, I believe, for them to answer. It's not up to me to speak as to when they realised that either the response wasn't being met in their departments, or whether at a personal level that they became truly aware of what needed to be done or what was being done.
All right, but can we take it from that, Mr. Swan, that when you sat down as a group of ministers on the 10th of March and were looking at the situation that was confronting you, there wasn't a sense or any kind of from what you could see, any kind of coherent, muscular cross-government response or understanding about what it would take to respond to the pandemic?
I think that's fair, because that I think then becomes reflected in the comments from the First and Deputy First Minister.
That obviously all points to very serious issues about planning, and I just want to ask you about two different aspects of the planning. We've already seen that from a very early stage you were aware that the pandemic would more seriously impact upon elderly people or people who had an underlying illness. And it doesn't take any great leap of imagination, does it, to also understand how non-pharmaceutical interventions might really seriously impact upon the most vulnerable people in society. Do you accept in the weeks that were leading up to the lockdown, or even months, that there wasn't sufficient attention paid or consideration given to those sorts of impacts and what, for example, a lockdown might actually do to people and their lives?
I do, and look, I regret that in regards to that level of preparedness as well, and I think that's why I think the seriousness, the intensity, the duration of that lockdown was not something that had been contemplated or planned for in regards to those additional supports. I think parts of government actually moved quickly in regards to that, and I will pay testimony to my colleagues in Department for Communities in regards to how they put certain steps in place as to supporting those people who were even clinically extremely vulnerable, or those people who've been locked down as well in regards to that, and extremely vulnerable, and also the other steps that were being taken by other departments as well as to how they can actually be supported. And I think that's when, following that period of intense lockdown, that the department actually asked their patient client council to do that piece of engagement work as to see what the implications or the effect of the lockdown had, especially in those people who were shielding in regards to that. And I think that's why, as Northern Ireland, we actually never went back to using that very technical phrase and that very, I suppose, severe measure of enforcing lockdown. And look, in my own department, we work with Department of Communities to make sure that community pharmacy were in place to make sure people were able to get their medicines as well. But I think it was a depth and extent of lockdown that hadn't been prepared for or planned, I think, across these islands, never mind just here in Northern Ireland.
But again, just coming back to your department, because you had responsibility for not just medical services in general terms, but also the full gamut of social care services as well. So even including things like social work, that again, a huge amount of that fell within your responsibility for those sorts of issues, fell within your department, didn't it?
They did, yes.
And I suppose, of course, it would require the involvement of other departments as well, because it would require a whole society response, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but it also, specifically in regards to social work, it also involved the change in regulations and legislation as to their effects. So we actually did that piece of work and that engagement as well, although it hadn't been done in preparation for the pandemic, but it's been done as part of this work as well. In regards to that, I suppose once the direction of travel had been established, that piece, and there was a large piece of engagement work across stakeholders in regards to that, to make sure that fostering could be supported, to make sure that children going into care homes could be provided as well as all the regimes around that as well. So that piece of work was been undertaken and led by the chief social worker.
Yes. I mean, we know obviously that things like the amount of contact that children had with social workers, it wasn't that extra provision was being made, but obviously that provision was being made, I think, so that children didn't, that the regulations that applied were lessened. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct,
so that's not about protection, that's about...
No, but it was also a realisation that we had a limited resource, especially in regards to social work. There was also a piece of work between my department and the Department of Justice as to access between parents and children as well, to make sure that those children that had to travel between two houses were also supported as well, that they weren't seen in lockdown as being part of that closed bubble. And that, very, very specific piece of work, but a necessary piece of work.
But just coming back then, Mr. Swan, to the role of the Executive Committee and your department was in charge of such a range of, or had such a range of responsibilities that went to perhaps some of the most core functions of government. For example, ensuring the safety of children, yes?
Yes.
That it might be thought even more surprising that there seems to have been so little of a cross-departmental or cross-government responsibility until a very late stage in the day in terms of responding to the pandemic.
I don't disagree with that approach, but I think it's no one perceived just how deep or how long the lockdown would actually be, or how total it would be across society in regards to that. So if you're asking me, was the planning done for that level? No, it wasn't, but I don't think it was done anywhere else either. I stand to be proven wrong. But in regards to that, and I think it shows the flexibility that we were able to work across departments, not having to be instructed by the executive office, but there was that interaction, my lady, to make sure that those actions were taken.
I was going to say that is something that is actually really different about Northern Ireland, for example, compared to central government, Mr. Swan, because we've seen that ministers from across government in the United Kingdom were attending COBRA. From at least the second meeting, there's a panoply of ministerial responsibilities. Do you agree?
I agree, and I say, I've said in my statement that I would have had no objection with other Northern Ireland ministers attending COBRA. I wasn't in charge of the invite. In hindsight, should I have been standing up and saying that we need more Northern Ireland ministers there? And I'm sure my Scottish and Welsh colleague probably think the same in retrospect. I don't know if they were being asked or.
I'm not really focusing on COBRA. I'm reflecting on the position in Northern Ireland and why it was distinct. So we can see, and I'm just going to use England or central government as an example, we can see the interconnected response by a number of ministers at the outset, can't we?
Yeah, I can't speak from experience. It's not something I've.
All right. Well, you can see that they're attending COBRA, can't you? And they're all being informed at the same time as to what's going on. Yes.
Yes.
And when we come to Northern Ireland, there isn't anyone, for example, who has the equivalent position of the Prime Minister, do we?
No.
There doesn't appear to have been anyone coordinating the response to the pandemic, I mean, well into March. Do you agree?
But I do think that if you're asking me, should there have been?
Yes.
Yes. And if you're asking me who it should have been, I firmly believe that should have been the role of, or the role of the executive office as that overarching body who coordinates. They don't have the same authority or remit as the Prime Minister, but it is about a coordinating, I suppose, umbrella organisation as to where they sit.
I think I just want to check, first of all, whether or not there's any disagreement or anything controversial about this, but I think you're accepting that, and we probably need to establish a date when you think this happened by, but right up at least until later into March. I mean, when would you put the date when there is actually a whole government response to Covid-19 in Northern Ireland? When did that happen? Did it happen?
I think we made moves towards having a coordinated response, but I think has been demonstrated through minutes, through executive. There was never, I think, at any time that we could say there was a whole government. There was departments coming together, my lady, and ministers working together, but there was always those who had a different opinion or a different approach as to what it is. So there was never that perception, I think, or that possibility at any time where the executive stood together and spoke as one voice that often on every issue. But I think there was a collective response. If you're asking me when TEO, when the First and Deputy First Minister raised their issues in regards to around the 10th of March, I think it takes until, I suppose, maybe June. Up until that point, papers coming to the executive in regards to the pandemic were health department papers. And I think it's around about June where FM and DFM take over that responsibility, and the options, the proposals, the recommendations being made to the executive actually come as an executive office paper.
All right. So, and I think what you're saying in your evidence is that shouldn't have been the case. That ought to have happened at a much earlier point in time, correct?
From a personal and from a departmental point of view, yes.
And I think, again, just thinking about what's different in Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, in addition to having this lack of government response, we also have the absence, don't we, of any kind of advisory body to, and I know we've touched on this already, advisory body to the Executive Office about the response to the pandemic, correct?
Yeah, but
It was all contingent upon the CMO attending executive committee meetings after
as well. But I don't think we can move on about what's different from Northern Ireland to the rest of the United Kingdom or even the Republic of Ireland without noting the challenges that do come being a mandatory five-party coalition. As I said at the early stages of my evidence, coming from the broad spectrum of politics in Northern Ireland, both in regards to constitutional but also socio-economic as well.
Well, Mr. Swan, I think the inquiry understands that, but I think it's about deepening the understanding of why the response in Northern Ireland may look quite different from other parts of the United Kingdom, having regard to the lack of a whole government response.
But I don't think the whole government response made some of the aspects, the majority of our aspects, any different in regards to lockdown, school closures, all those sections. I think we were doing the same thing despite, from what you term as not having a whole government response. So departments were taking certain steps in certain areas. The executive were making those collective decisions, although maybe not always unanimous in regards to what needed to be done. But we were taking a response in regards to what needed to be done.
What collective decisions did you take in the first part of the pandemic?
Well, I think in regards to those decisions, especially around March, we were taking decisions. The decision to close schools was actually an executive decision. It wasn't a whole government. Could not all the parties or not all the participants actually agreed.
1 second. Thank you. I'm going to move on, Mr. Swan, because another important part of your responsibility. I got that wrong.
Don't worry, Mr. Swan, you're well into your questions.
We're going to break now, I think.
Is a break now convenient to you?
Yes.
I'm afraid we're not going to be able to finish your evidence before the break, Mr. Swan. So I shall return at just after, 17 minutes past 3 or thereabouts. My lady, thank you. My lady, I've discussed with my learned friends the apportionment of their remaining time, so I'm going to deal with two more very short topics, and then my learned friends will deal with those that are remaining. Mr. Swan, in terms then of those two final topics, I think you fairly in your statement reflect in terms of perhaps challenges to the Executive Committee in Northern Ireland that you weren't helped by officials or politicians across the United Kingdom being understood to have potentially acted not in adherence with the COVID regulations, correct?
Correct, yes.
And you've also pointed to the fact that that was a problem in both the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom as well. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
But may I ask you, please, just about the specific issue of the funeral of Mr. Storey and the attendance of the Deputy First Minister and two other ministers at that, and ask you the question of whether you considered that presented particular challenges to the ability of the Executive Committee to function.
I used two examples in my witness statement, my lady, just to demonstrate that exact point, that this wasn't the challenges that we received on the aspects of COVID regulations being breached just in London, but also from both jurisdictions. In regards to that time period around the Bobby Storey funeral, it was extremely challenging. for the executive. I think it was extremely challenging for a lot of people in health and social care in regards to what was perceived by many as a blatant breach of COVID regulations. And I do appreciate and acknowledge Karen McCullen, the former Communities Minister, apology during our evidence session at the start of and during last week as well. But what made it particularly challenging from our point of view, and I mean from a health point of view, my lady, was, and I say in my statement, I think the executive response, and I know it has been challenged by the inquiry here today, but I think our executive response was strongest when the people of Northern Ireland saw that cross-party response, those cross-party media briefings in regards, and I don't mean it as in any way to take away from other media briefings, but those media briefings that portrayed the difficult messages, where it was the First Minister, Deputy First Minister and myself, I think portrayed to the people of Northern Ireland a really strong, united front of message, no matter what political spectrum or belief people came from. And I think the really demonstrable outworking of that funeral and that time as well, those joint briefings ceased in regards to the First and Deputy First Minister being able to share that platform. I think we lost part of the confidence of the general public, because those people who'd been looking either for the rationale or reason not to follow guidance and restrictions were given one in regards to that. But it also put then additional pressures on my department as well, because where we had been doing joint briefings or alternate briefings, those briefings fell then back to the Department of Health and myself and the Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Advisor to pick up as well. So from that point on, and it was an outworking of that the response then was again perceived and portrayed as being a health response, because we didn't have that that united response that we had previously. So that was, I think, the real, or one of the real outworkings of the aftermath of that funeral was the lack of joint message that we actually saw at that point.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Swan. The other point that I wanted to ask you about, please, if I may, and I'm not going to go back through, because we've done this with a number of witnesses, to understand how the pandemic progressed in Northern Ireland through autumn and winter 2020. We've explored that with the CSA and the CMO. But obviously we understand that it culminated, so to speak, in that difficult 4-day meeting over the course of the 4 days from the 9th of November onwards. First of all, I wanted to ask you your view as to the deployment of a cross-community vote in that context, and whether or not that was something you, as the Minister who was proposing the recommendations, agreed with.
My lady, those, I think at the start of the proceedings this morning, read out my involvement in politics in Northern Ireland, and there's been some highs and there's been some lows. I think those 4 days were the lowest I've ever experienced in politics in Northern Ireland in regards to the behaviour, the tenure, and how those meetings were actually portrayed, and the point we touched on earlier in regards to the almost live commentary as to the discussions that were being had as well in regards to what decisions were being taken, who was saying what, and almost, I wouldn't say targeting has been too strong a word, as to where certain proposals were being coming from during that period in time. But the deployment of a cross-community vote, where, as my lady, I think it is a legal position that is an illegal tool that is available to be used in a Northern Ireland executive meeting following the St Andrews Agreement. So whether it's legally right and able to use, I question where it was morally right and able to use at that point in time as well. And I don't accept it was to prove a finite point at any time in the response. It was done deliberately. The larger challenge, and I think it has been talked about and all the rest of it, my perception, personal perception of a cross-communities vote is to support one community's rights or identity over another. The fact that I, as a unionist minister, was bringing forward a recommendation that was then subject to a cross-community vote from another unionist party, to me steps outside the remit and rationale as to what that mechanism was actually created for and intended for. And again, sorry, just come back and tying it in with your previous point, I think during that time as well, because of the ongoings over those 4 days, the betrayal, the use of the cross-community vote, we lost, again, support of, I think, a section of Northern Ireland society in regards to how they perceived the behaviour or whether they should continue to respond to and follow guidance and recommendations and restrictions as to how it was being actually played out politically.
I think that it's the counter perspective to that has been that other ministers gave evidence about, and I'm thinking, for example, of Lord Weir, where he suggested that there wasn't really the space in the meetings to raise the legitimate counter-arguments, for example, about the economic impact on Northern Ireland or about the other consequences for Northern Irish society, and that the vote became necessary in order to ensure that there could be a proper debate about that.
But I think those debates were being had anyway. I don't think that the deployment of the cross-community vote was the end of a process. It wasn't to enable the start of a process or a discussion as well. It was actually to close down discussion on recommendations that were being brought forward by myself at that point in time. And in regards to talk about those recommendations, or actually to enable discussions at an executive meeting, is during that period towards the end where I took, my lady, the personal decision not to put recommendations into an executive paper, because I wanted to give the executive space to have a wider debate as to actually where we currently were in regards to the pandemic in Northern Ireland, because my concern at that point was if that paper had to come forward towards the end of those 4 days with a specific recommendation, that the cross-community vote would simply be deployed again, and we wouldn't have had the opportunity to actually have that wider conversation or understanding as to where we actually were.
Two very short points to finish then, if I may. The inquiry has obviously seen that the number of people who died in the second wave in Northern Ireland was greater than in the first wave. I think the first and perhaps obvious question is whether or not there had been a failure to learn lessons from the first wave, and whether that contributed to what happened in the second wave.
I think the lessons learned from a health perspective were clearly in place and clearly being deployed. I think coming into that from October really onwards, I think we lost the commitment of the people of Northern Ireland to follow some of the guidance and the regulations that we actually had placed and that actually were being observed in the first waves. Also in the first wave, it has been, it's been talked about that we actually entered lockdown at an earlier point of the wave and the virus in regards to that. So that's why that happened. But I think we had lost a lot of the commitment and respect for what we were actually being asked to do towards the end of that.
So do you think then the fact that Northern Ireland may possibly have been spared the very worst of the pandemic in the first wave may have meant that people in Northern Ireland just had their guard down when it came to the second wave? There
was also, as that culmination on not just about having their guard down, but I think people had seen the behaviours of politicians. The impacts of the Story funeral and October and November, I think, and maybe allowed people
probably people driving to test their eyes, that kind of thing.
I couldn't possibly comment, my lady.
My lady, those are my questions. I'll hand over to my learned friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Dobbin. Mr Wilcock.
Mr Swan, I ask you questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved families for justice, and I've got 5 topics I've been given permission to cover. Topic 1. I think, given your answers this morning, I think you'll agree, won't you, that it was very clear at a very early stage, probably even before COVID reached our shores, that the pandemic we were dealing with in early 2020 would disproportionately affect those who were older or disabled or medically vulnerable.
I think there was an acceptance that it would have a detrimental effect on large parts of society in Northern Ireland, but there was also a realisation, I think, as we moved through the understanding of the pandemic, that those particular groups that you refer to would be, yes,
disproportionately affected.
Yeah.
And are you aware that on Friday the inquiry heard evidence that on the 28th of January the UK Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, told Professor Michael McBride, the Chief Medical Officer to your department, that notwithstanding any scientific uncertainties, quote, we should now assume that asymptomatic transmission may be happening?
Well, I think in regards to, I listened to the CMO's response to that in regards to asymptomatic transmission, in regards to the understanding of that at that point in time. So from a medical point of view, I would accept what the Chief Medical Officer gave to the inquiry at that point.
Does it follow that the risk of asymptomatic transmission of COVID was recognised by the Department of Health, your department, as a concern since the Chief Medical Officer to the department received that message?
I think, and again, not to speak on behalf of what the Chief Medical Officer's response was, but looking back in regards to papers and correspondence that I have, I think the acceptance of asymptomatic transmission came about May of 2020.
Notwithstanding what Professor McBride had been told in January.
I think in regards to that conversation, the medical acceptance of asymptomatic transmission became, I suppose, accepted about May of 2020, and that's my understanding.
So the communication isn't about the medical acceptance or the medical certainty or the scientific certainty. It's about the assumption that measures should be proceeded on the assumption that it may be happening.
Well, in regards to the advice and guidance that I was given at that point in time, it wasn't until, as I say, May 2020 in regards that it was accepted.
In the light of that answer, can we have INQ 0000065689 on screen? This is a document that we've already looked at in a different context today. Can we go to page 6, please? And can you see that there is there an entry sorry, my eyesight's failing me. There, just there. A DOH can be tested if they have symptoms. Shared with COBRA, share with colleagues. I will do everything to protect my workers. Do you remember giving that reply in that meeting?
Sorry, I don't remember giving that reply, but as I said to earlier statements, I wasn't aware of this transcript being taken, whether it's verbatim, but if it's there, I do accept it. And it would be in response to the point made by the Deputy First Minister, where she asks, are we testing healthcare workers?
Do you agree that by not following Professor Whitty's advice to assume asymptomatic transmissioning was happening, and by limiting the testing at that stage only to symptomatic healthcare workers, you were unfortunately not, to use the phrase in that minute, actually doing everything to protect your workers?
And I think it goes back to the point and the date of that meeting in regards to the availability of testing. If I had the ability or the accessibility of testing that we had towards the end of 2020, when lateral flow devices were actually common and in use and in practice, I would really have loved to have been able to distribute and make testing more available than currently the limited availability we had at that point in time.
Either way, the effect was that not the testing that was required wasn't being done, was it?
But I think in response to that, the testing that was available, or the number of tests that were available, wasn't in proportionate as to what I would have liked to have done.
Topic 2. This morning you referred to high-level guidance that was sent out to care homes in, you thought, toward the end of February. And I think you've been shown over lunchtime some guidance that was sent to care homes in the middle of March. Can I just check, first of all, Was that the guidance you were referring to when you spoke this morning?
No, actually, and I did check on the 27th of February. Guidance for social and community care and residential settings was sent out. It was based on what was known about the virus at that point in time, and the guidance provided advice on how to help prevent spread, what to do if someone was suspected of confirmed COVID-19, individuals who've been travelling, and actions to take and if staff come into contact with someone who is self-isolating in regards to that. My lady, if that hasn't been provided to the inquiry, I will check with my team and make sure that it has, because that's the advice and the update that I was given.
I think that's a long way of saying, no, that wasn't what I looked at over lunchtime.
Oh, no, sorry, in
Just try and
regards...
confine yourself to the question. I know it's difficult, but you've got a lot to say. But we haven't got a lot of time.
No, and I suppose in reflection to the questions you actually asked was of what the document that I was shared with on the 17th of March was what I was referring to in the 27th of February. And I'd be clear, no, those are two different documents.
Thank you. Can I ask you then about the document you looked at lunchtime, which is the document dated the middle of March? I can take it to you if you wish, but it's right, isn't it, that just as you'd said the day before, that document states that, and I quote, where a resident of a care home is showing symptoms of COVID-19, steps should, and I emphasise should, be taken to minimise the risk of transmission through safe working procedures. Do you remember that phrase in that document?
I've since seen that document, and that's the phrase that's in it, yes.
Thank you. Bearing in mind the use of the word should in the guidance, can we have page 2 of INQ 000397066 on screen? And this should be a letter written to you, Mr. Pengelly, Professor McBride and others on the 23rd of March, the day before lockdown was announced, by a number of the largest providers of home care in Northern Ireland. Can you see in the first line of that letter that they explain that they are writing to you to, I quote, express their dissatisfaction at the insufficient leadership and action from your department and its associated trusts in relation to the COVID-19 challenge?
Yeah, that's what the letter states, yes.
Now, if we go to the first bullet point of their criticisms, you can see, can't you, that they assert that home care workers had been asked to deliver care to symptomatic clients without masks or visors. Do you agree that, in the words of the guidance your department had issued, this should not have happened?
That is correct, but again, recognising the challenges that we had with personal protective equipment across the whole of health and social care, not just with domiciliary care. Again, I accept that I would have wanted to do more to support in regards to that, but in regards to setting up, I think it was part of the earlier evidence in regards to those lines of supply, especially of PPE, through the independent care home providers to our trusts, as well as establishing that single point of contact.
The first bullet point asserts that, quote, home care workers are continually overlooked in policy guidance with little or no regard to the risk of contamination from delivering personal care. Do you agree that simply telling care homes in your guidance that where a resident is showing symptoms of COVID-19, steps should be taken to minimise the risk, fail to curtail the risk of contamination from delivering personal care to people you knew to be medically vulnerable?
And I think it's taken those, I suppose, those 2 points in unison, and I think we were taking steps as to the supply of PPE. I also made it a priority, not just in the supply of PPE, but also testing, but also vaccine deployment in regards to care home. At that point in time, it was challenging across the whole of health and social care. As I said earlier in my deliberations to the inquiry, when I came into office in January, I perceived our domiciliary care, our social care, to be the Cinderella service, because I do think they had been undervalued and unrecognised up until that point, and I think they really became the focus of attention during COVID in regards to actually the support, the delivery they were given to the most vulnerable in our society, and it's how we make sure and how we made sure that we support them.
And I think, to be fair to you, when you replied to that letter, you said that you accepted you had the department, not you personally. The department had more to do.
Yeah.
But the letter does go on to set out a number of other criticisms, some of which are described as incredible, before ending with the words, "We need leadership and actions which will allow our teams to slow the protection of the virus and protect the most vulnerable of our people." Even allowing for the unique difficulties you and your department were working under, was the, quote, dissatisfaction and frustration at the insufficient leadership and action from the Department of Health expressed in this letter understandable?
I do think, and look, that frustration that was coming from the independent care home providers was being also expressed from different parts of our health and social care system in regards from our nurses or hospital provision as well. So, unfortunately, it wasn't unique solely to health and our social care sector.
Can we have a look now at INQ 0001200717? And this time I'd like to look at paragraph 7, which is another aspect of the guidance that was issued in March, 17th of March. Can you see in paragraph 7 that this states that although there is no blanket ban on visit to nursing and residential homes at this stage, restrictions on visits are advised? Now, 2 weeks ago, the inquiry heard evidence from one of my clients, Marion Reynolds, that, as she put it in her statement, the stark reality for many of our members was that they could, quote, maintain little or no contact with vulnerable persons who were in hospital care settings from 2020 and for the remainder of the year, including after the long after care partner guidance, which should have enabled access to residents, was issued in autumn 2020. Could you tell us what steps your department took to ensure that the guidance enabling access to loved ones in residential or hospital settings was being disseminated and applied properly?
In regards to the dissemination, especially to residential homes, that was been done through RQIA in regards at the start because they had the direct contact with all those homes as well. So that's the steps that we were taking. The introduction of care partners was a frustration for me in regards to the delivery. Wasn't as uniform as we wanted it to be, and there was also challenges from I think some providers who were being not over precautious, but we're being precautious in the delivery of that in regards to how it could be utilised and should be utilised. So again, and I'm sure you've investigated in regards to, I think it's towards the November of 2020, where I actually put additional monies into the support of care homes so they could deliver care partner arrangements as well, because I think it's crucially important, and it was personal for me as well, that we shouldn't just look at care homes as facilities. They were the residents' homes. They were places that they perceived as being safety and supported as well. But during the COVID pandemic, it became increasingly difficult in some aspects to be able to support them and keep them safe.
Do you accept Marion Reynolds' criticism that sadly, whatever was done wasn't enough to keep people informed?
I do in regards to those communication structures, especially going through RQIA and through the trust as well in those early days. I've also, and in regards, and my lady, I don't mean this as a defence of those actions then, but the steps that have been taken in regards to how before leaving office I established a social care collaborative forum, working out from the I think the learnings of this, but at this point in time there was a weakness.
Topic 4. Can we have INQ 4023229 on screen, please? And if we look at the second and third paragraphs of that document, we will see that you wrote to the First and Deputy Ministers on the 29th of March that, and I quote, "Despite the pace at which this issue has evolved, I feel that our overall response thus far has been effective." will you accept from me that somewhere between 20 and 30% of deaths involving COVID in Northern Ireland during the pandemic between 2020 and 22 took place in care homes or residential settings?
And I think that has been demonstrated through ONS and NISRA figures as well, unfortunately.
And of course, those figures don't reflect the deaths of people who lived at home and who were receiving support from the care sector, but who went home and died at home. Do these statistics not reveal that rather than being, quote, effective, the government response in Northern Ireland was the opposite, starkly ineffective in protecting those in care homes?
I think, and as I've said, and I say that we could have done more. In regards to the supply and the support of how we actually affected not just those in care homes, but also those working in care homes and those providing care, especially in domiciliary care, and those people working and supporting vulnerable people within their own homes as well.
So is the answer yes?
Yes.
Finally, you told us this morning that your position as Minister of Health was, and I quote, lonely and challenging at times. And given some of the evidence we've heard about political relationships at times during the response to the pandemic, we can perhaps understand what you mean. In that context, can we look at INQ 000220391, please? And we understand that this is an email dated the 17th of December between two employees of the British Geriatric Society, in which the last paragraph but two, you are described as describing your weekly meetings with Matt Hancock and the other health ministers in Wales and Scotland as, quote, group therapy. Does the fact that you regarded even a meeting with Mr. Hancock as therapy give us some insight into the extent of the political, administrative and policy stresses you were under at this time?
I don't think too much should be read, and again, it's not an email that I written or had part of. But I will say at that point in time that the conversations of four health ministers at that point, taken aside what we know now in regards to certain individuals, was actually quite. It was engaging, but it was also one of those points which I actually think showed a political maturity, especially at a health level. I, as an Ulster Unionist Health Minister from Northern Ireland, was able to interact on same topics, same issues, have the same discussions with Matt Hancock, Tory Minister from London, Vaughan Gethin, Labour Cooperative Welsh Health Minister, and Jean Freeman, Scottish National Party Health Minister from Scotland. So there was a level of engagement that we were able to have at those meetings that wasn't available to, I would say, any of the four of us elsewhere.
The political maturity that you just described just didn't happen in Northern Ireland during the political response to the pandemic, did it?
In regards to, I think, and as part of, my lady, I think some of the challenges in Northern Ireland, that's that ability to develop personal relationships in politics in Northern Ireland, I don't think is there to the same extent, my lady, as it would have been in the past, where we saw politicians from Northern Ireland coming up through council chambers together, working cross-community together, working on cross-community projects together. Whereas now I think there's a sad reflection that Northern Ireland politics, rather than becoming more collegiate, has actually become more insular.
Mr. Swan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcock. Ms Davis, do you have a question?
I thought she said Miss Daines as
No,
the short form of my name.
I wondered if you changed your name. No, no, thank you. Anyway, Ms Davis, you have a question.
Yes, thank you, my lady. Just one. Mr. Swan, I ask a question on behalf of Disability Action. You accepted earlier in your evidence today that you regretted the lack of sufficient attention or consideration in planning for the pandemic response given to the impacts of NPIs on the most vulnerable people in society. You also referred in your January 2024 statement to the examples of your department's efforts to engage with groups disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. This included encouraging people to take part in a June 2020 survey to understand the impact of shielding on individuals and to inform next steps. You referred to the survey as the start of a constant conversation to ensure that the voices of those impacted by shielding is heard. On the 25th of November 2021, Disability Action wrote to you to request an urgent meeting to address the deficit within the Department of Health in planning associated with COVID-19, including the COVID-19 recovery plan, due to concerns about the disproportionate number of disabled people who had died from COVID-19, as well as concerns about access to essential health and social care. You responded on the 13th of December 2021. You acknowledged the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on disabled people and the immediate work that needs to be done. But you said that you didn't find that a meeting with Disability Action would be helpful at that juncture. Didn't refusing an urgent meeting requested by Disability Action not undermine any commitment by your department to meaningful engagement and that constant conversation with impacted groups?
My lady, I don't know. I have seen the letter. It's one on reflection where I could have answered differently at that time in regards to those engagements that I had, those engagements that I was having. I'm not sure in regards to the further engagement the Disability Action actually had with leading officials within my department based on that. That response would have been part of a process of engagement, and I can't comment in regards to what other further engagements Disability Action actually had with departmental officials in that commitment. But there is no, I can assure, no slight or no offence meant in that response, and I hope that you can take that back in regards to the Disability Action and who you represent.
So can I take that as you do accept that a meeting as requested would have been helpful to both Disability Action and also informing the next steps and processes being planned by your department?
In reflection at this point in time, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Davis. Mr Swan, those are all the questions we have for you. I think I need to explain the YouTube system or streaming at the moment isn't running, but I'm going to carry on because I think I'm fulfilling my duty to be accessible because the webinar and transcript are still being broadcast. But that completes your evidence for the day. I should have said this to Sir Michael McBride, so I don't know if he's following or was trying to follow till we had the technical hitch. Could you relay to him too, whatever findings I make, Mr Swan, both you and Sir Michael obviously had a huge burden placed upon you, and you obviously worked enormously hard, both of you. So thank you very much for all that you tried to do for the people of Northern Ireland then, as I say, whatever findings I may make. And thank you for all the help that you have provided. I know we make huge demands, especially on a serving minister, so thank you very much.
My lady, thank you.
And now I think we've got to have two witnesses to come in. I'm not going to rise, we're going to carry on through thick and thin. I'm sorry if we've kept you waiting a long time.
Hands and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
If you'd like to repeat after me, I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Can I ask you each, please, to give your full name to the inquiry?
Professor Anne-Marie Gray.
Professor Carl O'Connor.
Right, I'm going to try my very best to manage this, and I'll try and direct my questions to which of you I think is probably the best place to answer. But if I direct it to the wrong person, please just let me know.
And please don't worry, I will take into account your written report. So
Yes.
if there's something that you wanted to say afterwards you think about on the bus on the way home, then don't worry, I'll be bearing it in mind.
So to start, please, with your report, I think that you have it in front of you and that both of you signed that report on the 20th of April 2024. Yes?
Yes.
And I think that you have also signed an expert declaration in respect of that report, haven't you?
Yes.
I won't go through all of those preliminaries with you. I'm going to try, if I may, to just cut through this. But obviously, as part of your expert duties, you're also under a duty to draw to the attention of the chair if you've heard anything, for example, that undermines the opinion that you've provided here. Okay?
Yes.
And I think as well, if I can just take you through your respective expertise, I'm going to try and do this at a bit of a pace. But Professor Gray, I think you have a doctorate in the development of health services from the Ulster University.
Yes.
Is that correct? You're a professor of social policy at the School of Applied Social and Policy Sciences at Ulster University as well.
Yes.
You have a special interest in terms of your research in health and social care, devolution and social policy, and gender and social policy,
That's
correct?
correct.
And you've also written 2 books, I think, which touch on social policy and welfare as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I know that you've published a number of articles in journals. Those are set out in the report as well. You were a member of the Social Work and Social Policy Panel in 2022 as well. Is that within Northern Ireland?
No, that's the UK Research Excellence Framework Panel.
Okay, I'm grateful. And you're also the chair of the UK Social Policy Association
correct.
as well, and the chair of Youth Action in Northern Ireland also. And you teach on policy and government as well, and on collaborative policy making and health and social care as well.
That's correct, yes.
Professor O'Connor, I think it's right, you have a doctorate from the University of Exeter, and in fact it was awarded the Hutton Prize for Excellence in terms of improving standards of governance. Is
Yes,
that correct?
That's correct.
You're a professor of public administration and public policy as well, is that right?
That's correct.
At Ulster University also. And you're the research director for social work and social policy at that university also.
That's correct.
And you were the founding director of the Centre for Public Administration at the university as well.
That's correct.
Yes. And you have a special interest in the role of the civil servant in conflicted societies as well. Is that also right?
That's correct.
And as well as that, you remain, I think, the subject lead for public administration at Ulster University,
Correct.
and you have that. That's one of your current responsibilities. Yes?
Yes.
Now, I think between both of you, you probably cover the concept of good governance. Would that be an accurate way to put
Yes.
your report? What I want to do is to touch upon perhaps some of the most significant issues that you touch upon in your report, and perhaps to ask you whether or not any of the evidence that you have heard or seen or read in the course of the inquiry has changed any of your opinions. Now, first of all, I think I need to establish that I think you have watched a number of the witnesses give evidence
Yes.
or read the transcripts. Is that right?
Yes. Not all of them, but
Not all of them. Can I just check then, to be clear, whether or not between you have read or seen, for example, the evidence given by most of the senior civil servants?
yes.
Yes.
All right. And have you heard the evidence given, for example, by the Chief Medical Officer
Yes.
Yes.
and the Chief Scientific Advisor
Yes.
as well? All right, thank you. So one of the issues that's perhaps to the fore in your report is the concept of collective government responsibility. And what you said at paragraph 27 of your report, I won't take you to it unless we need to, is that an attempt to encourage a convention of collective responsibility has been met with limited success in Northern Ireland. And I think it's right that it follows from your report that because there is no government of the day in Northern Ireland, that's why there isn't a concept of collective responsibility, correct?
Yes.
But that nonetheless some of the principles that underpin it could nonetheless be applied in Northern Ireland, is that right?
Yes.
So turning first of all to one aspect of collective responsibility is the principle of the confidentiality of collective discussions on the part of ministers. In terms of any evidence you've heard, has your opinion advanced in any way in your report about that as a concept in Northern Ireland? Or do you have concerns, perhaps that might be a better way to put it, in terms of what you've heard in the course of this inquiry about the concept of confidentiality?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll speak for myself and you can speak for yours. I was disappointed to see the lack of confidentiality and respect for confidentiality in that room, to allow ministers to have an open and frank discussion about serious policy consequences. The way Cabinet should work in our system, the Westminster system and our version thereof, is that we expect ministers from a broad array of backgrounds to be able to discuss openly and frankly the possibilities and the different recommendations that have been put to them by their senior civil servants. And if we are to have confidence in our governance system, that discussion needs to take place at that table, not in pre-meetings beforehand, not in, and certainly not with a running commentary to the media while these conversations are happening. So I was disappointed, but not altogether surprised.
All right. Well, it may seem like an obvious question, but detrimental to good governance in Northern Ireland that should have been a feature of
Yes.
collective discussions throughout the pandemic.
Without a shadow of a doubt, yes.
And
I can see you agreeing.
yep, and I completely agree, but also detrimental in terms of the public perception and how that lack of confidentiality presented to the public perhaps a picture of a dysfunctional executive, and the harm that may have created in terms of the public trust in the messages being communicated, both by individual members of the executive, but by the executive as a whole as well.
All right. Another part of your report that you have linked to there not being a formal concept of collective responsibility is a possible tendency on the part of departments to act in an autonomised or compartmentalised way. And again, has any of the evidence that you've heard in the inquiry advanced the opinions that you express in your report about that? Or again, added to concerns that you might have about how departments operate in Northern Ireland?
Yes, it is unfortunate, but there are good reasons for the Good Friday Agreement being set up as it was, but each of our departments are a separate legal entity, as you've heard on numerous occasions. This can lead to siloing, more so than in Westminster and other governments. And one of our frustrations was that the arrangements for interdepartmental working in times of a crisis were not initiated sooner, because that could have helped collate information from across various different departments at a mid-level, mid-civil servant level and senior civil servant level, to allow for learning to happen across departments before the pandemic actually took hold in Northern Ireland.
Before we go to, or Ms Dobbin takes you to the triggering of NICMA arrangements, can I just take you back to, because of the particular circumstances in Northern Ireland, you have the separate departments, separate ministers, separate civil service, which I confess came as a surprise to me when I started these hearings. I can see just about why you might have separate ministers who are autonomous in their departments because of the particular circumstances in Northern Ireland. What I still find hard to follow is having separate civil service departments and no overall. Still find that difficult to get.
It is difficult, but the permanent secretary is responsible to the minister. So if the ministers don't have collective responsibility, it'd be very difficult for the permanent secretaries to respond to the executive as a whole. Now, they are responsible to the assembly as a whole through the...
But if you had, as we have in England, you had what they call the Home Civil Service, the permanent secretaries could be responsible to the chief of the head of the civil service, surely?
Yes.
I appreciate that's not the case here, but
No.
still can't. I can see how politicians might be separate. I can't work out why the civil service has to be.
Traditionally, the head of this, and it's different now, but traditionally the head of the civil service was also the permanent secretary for the executive office, which was under the first and deputy first minister, which may have meant that it would be difficult for a permanent secretary from a department that was not part of the two main parties to accept direction from a head of a civil service.
Anyway, we are where we are, and the only answer, and this is where I interrupted, is to ensure that you trigger the cross-government department working in a time of emergency. That's the only answer. Right? Sorry, I interrupted.
No, Professor Gray, did you have anything to add on that?
Very little,
point?
except to say that unfortunately, I think the lack of cooperation between government departments really during this pandemic really reinforced a history of an inability really to cooperate effectively, particularly on substantive issues of social policy and issues where there was likely to be some ideological disagreement. And I think that came to pass during the pandemic as well with regard to issues such as the easing of restrictions, for example.
All right, just coming back, if I may, to the not standing up of the civil contingencies arrangements for some time. I think the point that has been made on behalf of some civil servants was that there may not have been enough people in order to do that. So that's what's been said, but just putting that to one side, there appears to have only been one civil contingencies meeting of officials, which took place on the 20th of February. Mm-hmm. I think until about the 18th of March, and I think there was one meeting of ministers on the 12th of March. Does it surprise you that there should have been no other meetings, if it's right, apart from those?
I'm sure there would have been informal meetings, and I know that from the evidence that was presented here that civil servants had been taking this very seriously before the 17th of March. And I know only too well that our civil service has been understaffed for many, many years. So I do accept that point. However, given what we knew as February progressed was happening in the rest of the world, and given how late the virus came into Northern Ireland, I think, and this is with the benefit of hindsight, that it would have been prudent to step up those civil contingencies arrangements much earlier. While it would have taken people away from other very important tasks, bear in mind at this time our civil service has already been pared down, so is only working on what it is statutorily required to do due to underinvestment for a number of years. So to pull a resource from somewhere is going to mean that we're going to stop doing something. And it's very difficult to stop doing something that you're more than likely obliged to do by law. So this redeployment of staff wouldn't have been an easy decision. And where would this staff have come from? Now, if we were able to do it for preparing for EU exit, surely we would have been able to do it in preparation for a pandemic.
So is your point, Professor O'Connor, that because there had been those preparations had in fact been arranged for, or in the event of a no-deal Brexit, and I think that included the creation of this special room that we heard about from Minister Swan, and that very many people, for example, had been trained, that the question you're posing is the one you've just said: if you can in fact do all of that, what happened when it came to the pandemic? Why is there not an equivalent response? Is that effectively what you're saying?
I agree.
All right. Professor Gray, do you have anything to add on that? We've also seen, perhaps in the course of the inquiry, about the very important role that was played by the Chief Medical Officer. And perhaps the lack of other advisory structures that were available in Northern Ireland as well. Do you think that ought to be a cause for concern? So in other words, the fact that there isn't perhaps a structural response, but rather a response to individuals to these circumstances?
If I could go for it. It does certainly seem, at least in the early days of the pandemic, that there was a lot of responsibility, a lot of weight on the Chief Medical Officer. And we have heard from the CSA's evidence, for example, and other evidence that he was returning to work after some time as well. I think one thing to note is that our Chief Medical Officer has a very wide range of responsibilities. It's comparable, for example, or compared, for example, to the Chief Medical Officer in England. Now, the role, the responsibilities, the accountability of Chief Medical Officers does vary quite considerably between countries. But if we stick to within the UK, then the Chief Medical Officer for England, Sir Chris Whitty, is the UK Government Chief Medical Officer. He's not a Department of Health Chief Medical Officer in the way that Sir Michael McBride is in Northern Ireland, for example. And when we look at Sir Michael's, the range of responsibilities he carried, the range of policy and strategic responsibilities, and alongside that then responsibility as an independent public health advisor and as the head professional for public health responsible for communicating messages to the public as well. I think it does raise questions about the weight of responsibility being placed on that individual within the Department of Health.
And just in terms of, you said about the CMO providing independent advice, but I think it's been established that he is, in fact, he's not just an advisor to the Department of Health, but is also part of the management
Yes,
of the Department
yes.
of Health as well. Again, ought that to be a cause for concern, the fact that there isn't, as it were, independent advice across government in Northern Ireland?
And I think I would say that there are other countries where that is also the case, where a chief medical officer would have those kind of dual responsibilities. However, it is again, more unusual if we compare Northern Ireland to the situation in England. And I do think that in the context of a pandemic, whenever things are moving quite rapidly, whenever there's new information emerging, some of that is going to be potentially controversial within government. That it does raise questions about the complexity of that role then in trying to disentangle one set of responsibilities from another, and being able to give or feeling able to give entirely independent advice when you also carry policy responsibilities. Now, I'm not saying that the Chief Medical Officer did not have the ability to do that, but I'm saying is that it would be quite a challenging thing to do, I think, in those circumstances.
It might be thought, and the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister have yet to give evidence, that the response to the pandemic was seen almost entirely through the lens of a health response, possibly as opposed to a whole government response. And again, I wonder from the evidence that you've seen and heard whether or not you have an opinion on whether the evidence potentially points towards that.
Yes.
I think it does, certainly in the early phases of the pandemic. It certainly does. It looks like an unusually long delay in Northern Ireland in this pandemic being accepted as something which has to have a whole system or a whole government response.
Professor, I can see that you're nodding.
Yes, it's a cross-cutting issue across government. While health was the lead department, the clues in the title, they're the lead department. They're not the sole department, and they should, at one point, have been leading the response. But it is a cross-cutting issue that was across all departments, and it required a response from every single department.
And again, do you think that is that something? Do you think that ought to have been more obvious at an earlier point in the pandemic?
Yes.
And just perhaps moving on, we haven't actually heard very much about any other structures being involved in the response to the pandemic. But we know that there was this civil contingencies group that after the 18th of March did start to meet, but wasn't a decision-making group, and that most of the decisions were taken by the executive committee. And again, in terms of your expertise in governance, did you have any other concerns about the way civil contingencies arrangements were configured, or the sort of structural response once they were actually stood up?
My understanding was, and correct me if I'm wrong, was the CCGM for ministers and the executive committee were one and the same?
They became one and the same, yes.
So I would, the system as designed could potentially have worked quite well, where departmental operation centres
Yes.
would have fed information to a hub based or responsible to the head of the civil service. That hub would have collated that information and presented it in an accessible format for permanent secretaries to communicate to ministers, for ministers to have an open discussion with all of the knowledge from across the departments in front of them. That sounds very simple, but in practice it's a lot more difficult. But it all started from what we've read beforehand, that the hub found it difficult to get information out of the departments. They had no line management responsibilities of people working in the departments, so they could not command people. Not that we should ever command, but that we should entice people to give us information so that it can be collated effectively and presented effectively to permanent secretaries and then to ministers in a collated format. And for me, in the midst of a pandemic, that can put a structural order on decision making so that a number of different eventualities are taken into account. It's not about this works for health, so let's run with it. What are the implications for communities? What are the implications for the disadvantaged, the disabled, the elderly, the young people? Everyone has an opportunity around the cabinet table or the executive table to contribute.
In the evidence that you've seen or what you've heard and what you've read, have you been able to locate anywhere what the centralising, coordinating part of the response to the pandemic was? Or who took on that role, if anyone?
I'll go first, but then you can.
Yeah.
There was obviously a clear frustration among our very, very experienced civil servants at the outset of the pandemic that this was not being taken seriously politically. I think that's what caused, and this is my own assumption, that's what caused them to work around the normal structures, which is what we always do in Northern Ireland. We never work through the normal structures. Whenever there's a difficult issue, we try and work around them. But as we work around them, because we're a small society, different lobby groups and action groups will be brought to the table to discuss and input into the process. Given that this was a fast-moving pandemic response, when civil servants try to work around the blockages, there isn't the opportunity or there may not be the opportunity for these groups to input into that process. So, a long-winded answer to your question, I think in the early days of the pandemic, I think it was a very strong civil service response and a very clear frustration on the part of the civil service that there was a lack of political direction at that time. As the pandemic progressed and we move into the autumn, we see growing political dominance in the process, which is usually to be welcomed. It is a democracy after all. And what we're expecting to see is, with this political dominance, a clearer instruction to civil servants. That's what civil servants crave. They want direction from their ministers and from government. They were very frustrated at the outset that they didn't have that clear direction from government. In the what we call the second phase of the pandemic, or in the autumn of the pandemic, while there was more political influence, that still didn't lead to what we would call good government or clear direction.
Yeah. Professor Gray, sorry, do you have...
No, just briefly to concur with that and to say I think we would have expected the lead to have been taken in the early stages by the Department of Health. You know, it was identified as a global health pandemic. What we might then have expected to see was a more coordinated response as the realisation struck that it wasn't going to be short term, that it was going to involve education, it was going to involve issues around children's services, issues around people's disabilities, domestic abuse and so on. And we didn't see that scaling up of a coordinated response for quite some time. And then when it did happen, we see the political tensions creeping in, which made it difficult then for an efficient response to be activated at times.
Okay, I'm going to move on to a different topic to ask you about, this is a very specific topic, to ask you about the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed with, I think we're unclear it was signed because we have an unsigned copy, but we understand it was concluded and agreed between the respective, I think, departments of health. And I think the CMO, in fact, said that he had signed it. And again, just to ask you about that, the idea that a memorandum would be signed between officials as opposed to perhaps respective political leaders or permanent secretaries, is that a surprise, or again, is that an inevitable consequence of the political position?
It's potentially both. I think at that level of what was attempting to be agreed at this time, one might have expected to have seen political input. So for that memorandum of understanding to have been signed by officials, if that was the case, by the chief medical officers, it potentially raises issues of political commitment to the memorandum of understanding in the first place, or to or maybe a reflection of historical collaboration as well. You know, it's one thing to step up collaboration in an emergency if there has been fundamentally good and sustained working relationships and processes in place. It's quite another and challenging thing to do that if that hasn't been the case. And I think, you know, witnesses have previously spoken and written in evidence about the areas where there has been, you know, really quite successful north-south collaboration around cancer services, children's heart surgery and so on. But I wouldn't say it has been the case on a day-to-day basis that officials, you know, have had that relationship, or politicians in the areas of health have had that relationship.
So, I mean, setting aside political leadership, would you have expected perhaps even this sort of MOU might have been signed by the Executive Office with a counterpart in the Republic of Ireland?
Certainly.
Okay. My lady, those were all of the questions that I was going to ask. Have you any questions?
No, I haven't. Thank you. Well, just one question. Going back to collective responsibility. Sorry, it's a long time since I did constitutional law, so forgive me. How do you have collective responsibility when you have a coalition of 5 diametrically opposed?
We don't have
political
collective
parties?
responsibility.
No, you don't, do you?
No, we don't. No.
I mean, Ms Dobbin went from collective responsibility to confidentiality. I think there are 2 different concepts.
Yes. Yes.
So it's basically collective responsibility impossible if you have this kind of coalition.
The difficulty in Westminster, if you had the SNP, Labour, the Lib Dems and the Tory party governing the response, the Conservative party, governing the response to the pandemic, and you expected cabinet collective responsibility, might be difficult.
And we don't, constitutionally, the concept doesn't apply in Northern Ireland because it's accepted that in a mandatory coalition that would be difficult, but they are, I think the Minister's Code of Practice is that they're supposed, where possible, to achieve decision making by consensus. But the norms of collective responsibility, as we would understand it from, you know, the Whitehall model, for example, don't apply.
Going back to the question of leaking, which I find extraordinary, and I did ask one witness, I think, why do they bother to take the ministerial oath if they're just going to disobey it? But there are practical ways, although not with remote meetings, as pointed out this morning, but there are practical ways like saying you can't be using your device when you're physically present in a room. But has anybody looked into whether there are any legal devices, like is it misconduct in a public office?
I don't checked. No, I don't. But
it's just a thought. If you take an oath,
well, it does go against as a civil servant. It would go against your integrity, and that is part of your code of conduct.
But it must breach the ministerial code. When you attend an executive meeting, you're conducting your public office. I just think it's something that this country, or this Northern Ireland, should not have to put up with. And I'm just trying to think of ways to try and stop it.
Although we do have, prior to the pandemic, we had, a number of examples of ministers speaking in public against another minister, or on some occasions a minister taking another minister to court over decisions. And I think, as Professor O'Connor said earlier, it is just the unique circumstances of our arrangements, our governance arrangements here, that such things are tolerated or maybe expected.
Well, I think it's time they stop being tolerated, but there again, I'm an outsider, so
No,
easy for me
we
to say.
fully agree as well.
Thank you both very much indeed. As I say, thank you for your written report. I'll make sure that I read that with great care. Poor Miss Dobbin had to canter through this afternoon.
Yes, I apologise for that.
Thank you very much for your help. Very grateful.
Thank you.
Very well. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, please.